Today we have some more actual history about the life of Tom Quick, the man known as the Indian Slayer, who lived near Milford, Pennsylvania between 1734 and 1795. In this episode, we will hear about some of Tom's interactions with the Indians, probably in the period between the end of the French and Indian War in 1763 and the beginning of the American Revolution, around 1776, although the specific dates for many of these events are not known. These stories tell more about Tom's lifelong vendetta against Indians, following his father's murder at their hand in 1756 by Delaware Indians under the command of Tedious-Gun. We will be reading from this book, Tom Quick, the Indian Slayer. This book was published by James Quinlan all the way back in 1851. So here are more tales of Tom's revenge against the Indians. We have now reached a period of Tom's life, towards which tradition does not point with certainty. There is a gap which we cannot fill except with certain legendary accounts of real or supposed exploits, which our authorities do not assign to any particular time. Almost innumerable tales are told of Tom's encounters with the Indians, and of the tact and cunning he resorted to in order to circumvent them. Many of these stories, we think, have been invented by ambitious tale-tellers, in their anxiety to outdo their companions in relations of the wonderful. But on the other hand, some of them are true, or founded on facts, a few little additions having been made from time to time, as they were handed down from father to son. As often as we have heard conflicting versions of the same story, we have adopted the one that seemed the most plausible to us, or we have collected sufficient information to enable us to determine what was worthy of being recorded. This will explain to those who have furnished materials for this little work why we do not always follow the thread of their narrative very closely. The story of the buck with 7 skins which follows, although it has an air of probability, we place it at the head of the apocryphal tales of Tom. Tom usually wintered at the house of some congenial spirit on the frontier. The family upon which he quartered himself was always well paid for boarding him, for as long as Tom was with them they lived upon the fat of the land. He, as previously stated, invariably supplied them with an abundance of venison and bear meat. Once he found that winter was near at hand, and that he had not the usual supply of venison for the person whom he intended to stay with, he was about to engage in a hunt at some distance, where he was quite sure he would find deer enough in a few days to supply his friend's cabin as long as he desired, when an Indian came into the neighborhood. Tom made his acquaintance as soon as practicable, and it was not long before they agreed to go on a hunt together. Tom agreeing to take the venison for his share, and the Indian the skins. The first day they were out, they had unusual good luck. Deer was plenty, and indeed the woods seemed full of them. They killed one after the other, skinned them, and hung them up on the hindquarters, where they would be secure from wolves and other wild beasts until Tom could take them away. In the afternoon they found they had killed 7. The Indian was in fine spirits, and so was his white companion. Both had done a very fine day's work. The Indian had as many skins as he could carry, and consequently did not wish to hunt any more at that time. So he got them together and placing them upon his back, started for his cabin. He never reached it, however, for as he started off Tom fired his rifle and down tumbled the Indian, the ball having gone through the 7 skins and into his heart. When Tom reached the settlement with the skins and venison, his friends who knew the bargain he had made with the Indian asked him how he came by all the hides, and his reply was that after they had got through with their hunting, he had killed a buck with the 7 skins on his back. The next winter was spent by Tom with Ben Haynes at Handsome Eddie. Tom was not only in the habit of shooting the Indians as they passed up and down the Delaware in their canoes, but he frequently waylaid them as they were traveling from one part of the country to another in their usual paths. With all these paths he was well acquainted, and he would spend days and weeks in lurking in their vicinity for the purpose of getting a shot. The number of Indians who had disappeared mysteriously, and the fact that some of them were last seen with Tom, and that he had swore to kill Indians as long as he had an opportunity, caused the natives to suspect he could tell what had become of them, and the whites knew that he could, if he pleased, find the rifles of the missing. The Indians, therefore, were anxious to kill him, and many attempts were made by them to shoot him. It is said that they had frequent opportunities, but that they missed their mark so often that they finally believed he had a charmed life, and could not be touched by an Indian ball. The following is a fair sample of the stories told in the neighborhoods where his adventures took place, concerning the way the Indians attempted to catch or kill Tom. One spring, Tom was splitting rails for a man named Westbrook, who lived in the Mamakating Valley. He had got hold of a rather tough log to split, and was driving in a wedge, when he suddenly found himself surrounded by 7 Indian warriors. They told him that he must go with them, to which he readily agreed, provided they would help him split the log. They were so pleased at getting Tom without a fight, that they threw down their guns, and each one thrust his hand into the opening or split, according to the directions of Tom, who said he would drive the wedge in. However, he gave a well-directed blow and drove it out, and thus fastened the whole 7 by catching their fingers in the half-split log. He then killed them, one after the other, and at his leisure. This story has been told of Tom for more than half a century. It is almost too wonderful to be true. We give it as it was related to us by an old man named Page, who died recently, aged more than 100 years. He assured us that it was well-founded, that he had been often at the place where the Indians were killed, and that he had more than once seen their bones on the spot. An Indian came to the house where Tom had put up for the winter, and asked permission to stay all night, which was granted. He professed to be very friendly, but Tom's quick eye soon discovered that all was not right, and that he had an enemy to deal with. During the evening, the Indian pretended he had seen a great many deer a few miles off, and asked Tom if he would not like to go the next day and kill some of them. Tom pretended that he was pleased with the proposal, and agreed to go. During the night, Tom managed to get the Indian's rifle, which he unloaded, and afterwards substituted ash in the place of the powder, and put back the ball, and placed the rifle carefully where he had found it. The next morning the Indian slyly inserted the ramrod in the chamber of the rifle, examining the priming, etc., and seemed satisfied that all was right. This and some other circumstances confirmed Tom in the belief that mischief was brewing. There was considerable snow on the ground, and the hunter found it quite inconvenient to tread through it, and apparently to render the walking easier, the Indian proposed that one of them should go ahead to break the path. To this Tom readily agreed, and the Indian was greatly pleased when Tom made no objection to be the first to go in advance. After they had proceeded in this way a mile or 2, and had come to a very lonely place, Tom heard the Indian's gun snap, and the powder flash in the pan. Tom looked back and asked what the Indian had seen. "A fine buck," was the reply. The Indian reprimed his gun, and they went on. Pretty soon Tom heard another snap and flash. "Well, brother Indian," inquired he, "what did you see this time?" "An eagle swept over the forest," replied the other as he again primed the gun. "Brother Indian," said Tom, "the snow is deep. I am tired. You go ahead." "Brother Yankee speaks well," said the Indian gloomily, and took his station in advance. Tom leveled his rifle. "Lying Indian dog!" exclaimed he. "What do you see now?" "The spirit land," was the reply, as the Indian hung his head, and drew over it his blanket. The Indian was soon dispatched, and Tom returned without any venison, but with 2 rifles. Tom was wandering through the woods one day without his rifle, when he encountered a young Indian who was armed. Tom spoke to him in a friendly manner, and soon found himself on very good terms with the stranger. "Brother Indian," said Tom, "would you like to see Tom Quick?" The Indian answered in the affirmative, and Tom agreed to show him the Indian killer. After a long walk which terminated on a high ledge of rocks, at the foot of which were a few acres of cleared land, Tom told the Indian to wait a few moments, and he would show him the person they were looking for. Tom went to the brink of the precipice and peered over it. "I do not see him yet, brother," said he, "but he will soon come along." He continued to watch for several minutes, and at last pretended that he saw the person whom the Indian was so anxious to encounter. "There he comes," said Tom. "Here, you take my place if you want to get a good sight at him." The Indian cocked his rifle, and hastily and eagerly advanced to Tom's side. "Where is he?" inquired the Indian. "There, there," said Tom, pointing so that the Indian would lean over the brink, in his desire to shoot the enemy of his race. A little further," whispered the Indian slayer. The Indian hung over the precipice as far as he could, without losing his equilibration. He peered closely into the shrubbery at the outskirts of the field, and into the field itself, without making a discovery. In the meantime, Tom slipped behind him, and suddenly, grasping the shoulders of the Indian, and shouting, shoot me, would you?" he hurled the Indian over the precipice. The Indian fell upon the rocks below, and was killed. Tom left the body of the Indian to feed the crows and the foxes, and went on his way rejoicing. The Indians captured Tom several times, but they could never manage to keep him until they reached their villages. They were always anxious when they had him in their power to preserve his life until they reached home, so that they could there apply the torture to their wily enemy, and this is the reason they did not slay him at once. On one occasion they surprised him while he was asleep, but when or where is not positively known, although it is probable the occurrence took place not far from Port Jervis. They immediately bound him securely, and after plundering the cabin in which they found him, they set out for their own country, and by the way of the Delaware. Tom, as usual, had a large number of skins in his possession, all of which the Indians appropriated to themselves. It seems that 2 Indians were engaged in this adventure, one of whom in returning carried Tom's goods and chattels on his shoulders, and walked in advance of the prisoner, while the other had possession of the rifles of himself and his companion, one of which was kept cocked and ready to shoot Tom with, if he attempted to escape. This Indian brought up the rear. For some time the Indians traveled on the beach of the river or on the bank. At last, however, they came to a high ledge of rocks, where they were under the necessity of taking a very dangerous path far up on the cliff. They were obliged to travel some part of the way, within a few feet, and indeed almost directly on the brow of the precipice. One would think this afforded a poor place to escape, but it was just the one that suited the Indian slayer. He pretended to be dizzy and afraid of falling off the rocks, and passed along as far from the brink as possible. He several times hesitated to go on, and the Indian who followed him frequently applied the butt of his musket to urge him forward. He was determined not only to escape, but to kill the Indian who followed him, a difficult feat for an unarmed man to accomplish, especially with his hands bound securely behind him, but it was an easy one for Tom. When they had readied the narrowest part of the path, Tom was suddenly seized with a very severe attack of dizziness, and could hardly be compelled to proceed, although blows fell thick and fast upon his back and shoulders. Finally he stopped altogether, and refused to go a step further. He leaned against the bank on the upper side, and shuddered whenever he cast his eyes toward the river. The Indian, after beating him severely, attempted to take hold of him to push him along. By an adroit movement, Tom got between the Indian and the precipice, and the next instant the Indian was making a rapid airline descent toward the river. After falling 40 or 50 feet, he landed in the crotch of a buttonball tree. The Indian's back was broken by the fall, and he hung in the tree powerless and roaring for his brother Indian to help him. The rifles fell into the river. Tom was almost instantly cured of his dizziness. He next relied on his heels for security, and ran with astonishing celerity towards home. The Indian who had carried the plunder ran after him for a short distance, but finding it useless to attempt to catch him, he returned to assist his companion. Tom and 2 or 3 of his nearest neighbors returned in a short time to recover the plunder, and look for the Indians, but could find neither the one or the other. Tom's habit of concealing guns in the woods on one occasion saved his life. The Indians, 2 in number, had captured him, and were taking him off by the grassy brook routes. He seemed perfectly resigned to the fate which appeared to be unavoidable, and marched with them unreluctantly. His arms were pinioned with deerskin thongs, and his captors kept upon him a vigilant eye, and were ready at any moment to shoot him if he attempted to break away from them. After a while they were visited by a shower of rain, and Tom soon found that the thongs which bound his wrists began to stretch, and ultimately that they had become so loose that he could, whenever he thought proper, free his hands. He was very careful to conceal this fact from the Indians, and patiently waited for a favorable opportunity to run or do something else to escape. Beside the path they were passing was a very large chestnut tree, which was hollow, and on the side of the trunk that was furthest from the path, the wood had entirely rotted away, leaving a large hollow space. In the opening thus made, Tom had not long before concealed several guns, which he had found by the side of dead Indians. He had also deposited them with a flask of powder and a goodly store of bullets. When they reached this tree, Tom expressed an urgent desire to go to it, and gave such a good reason for the request he made that his captors consented to let him go. They permitted him to do so the more readily because he had thus far given them but little trouble. The Indians cocked their rifles when Tom stepped from the path, and aimed them at him. Each with a finger on the trigger watched him eagerly, determined to bring him down if he made the least movement to escape. Tom proceeded towards the tree very leisurely, and on reaching it went behind it, and was concealed from the view of his enemies. With almost inconceivable rapidity, he charged 2 or 3 of his weapons with powder and lead. The Indians, little suspecting what Tom was at, stood in the path with hardly a twig to screen them from his murderous aim. Tom afterwards said that he did not stop to return the ramrods to their places until he had as many of his guns loaded as he thought he should need. He hesitated a moment after he was ready to shoot, fearing that his guns would miss fire in consequence of their late disuse. But knowing that this was probably his last chance, he blazed away at one of the Indians, who fell dead in his tracks. The other attempted to get behind the nearest unoccupied tree, but he never reached it. A bullet sent him to the spirit land, to join those who had fallen by Tom's hands. An Indian who thought he was more shrewd and cunning than his fellows undertook to kill Tom without aid from anyone. He lurked in the vicinity of the cabin where Tom was staying, devising a plan to overreach the wily white man. The Indian found that the owner of the cabin had a hog, which was confined to a pen close by the hut, and he determined to make this stupid animal the means of producing Tom's destruction. One evening when no one but the Indian slayer was in the cabin, the Indian got into the pen, which being made of logs afforded a very good breastwork. He then caught the animal and holding it between his knees, made it squeal as lustily and shrilly as if a bear had hold of it. The Indian expected that Tom would rush out without proper precaution to rescue the porker, but he was mistaken. Tom was always on his guard. The Indian slayer caught up his rifle, ascertained that it was all right, looked through a crevice in the door towards the hog pen, but at first he did not see anything which led him to think that the hog was not attacked by a bear or a panther. He was on the point of starting for the pen, when he saw something which made him pause. The Indian endeavored to screen his body behind the logs of which the pen was constructed, and at the same time peer over the top to watch for the coming of Tom. But the hog did not prove a very tractable steed. It was so fractious and unmanageable that, just as Tom had concluded to open the cabin door, the head of the Indian was thrust above the topmost log. This was enough for the Indian slayer. Tom opened the door of the cabin a few inches, so that he could have a fair chance to shoot when the scalp lock of the Indian made its appearance the second time. The hog continued to jump and frisk and squeal, and the Indian soon exhibited his head again, when the porker was speedily released from its burden. Tom fired. The hog suddenly ceased to utter its ear-splitting notes, and the Indian took up the burden of his swinish melody. With a piercing yell he jumped from the enclosure, and endeavored to flee to the adjoining woods. But he had received a deadly wound, and Tom easily overtook him. Of course the fate of the Indian was sealed. Tom had no mercy on him, and killed him with fewer compunctions of conscience than he would have felt at crushing a reptile. According to an old Indian legend, Tom had a very severe battle with an Indian who came to him while he was in a field at work. Tom saw the Indian approach unarmed, and did not feel afraid to encounter him on equal terms. The Indian told a plausible tale about something that he pretended he had discovered not far off, and which he wished his brother Yankee to see. Tom, apparently without suspecting anything was wrong, consented to go with the Indian. His quick eye, however, saw a gleam of malignant satisfaction on the countenance of his visitor, which told him plainer than words could have done what was the errand upon which the Indian was bent. The Indian had discovered Tom from a hill nearby, and had concealed his gun in the woods, hoping to entice Tom to his neighborhood while he was unarmed, and then, when he could not defend himself, kill him. Tom was never caught napping. He was now wide awake, and concluded that there was a trap set for him. He had gone but a short distance with the Indian, when he came to a hemlock knot, which he concluded would be a very good weapon in a rough and tumble fight. He stopped to pick it up when the Indian, perceiving what he was at, sprang upon him. Tom got hold of the knot, but with his antagonist upon him, he could not use it. A long struggle for life or death ensued between them. Tom finally succeeded and was once more a conqueror, but to the day of his death he averred that this was the hardest and most severe fight that he was ever engaged in. When he had killed the Indian, he was so exhausted that it was with difficulty that he got to the house where he had found a temporary residence. According to another legend, a native attempted to kill the Indian slayer while he was engaged in a sawmill. Tom by some means found that an Indian was close at hand, and arranged his hat and coat in such a way as to deceive his would-be destroyer. While the Indian thought he was about to shoot Tom between the shoulders, as the latter had shot Musquink, Tom was in a position to send a bullet into the body of the Indian, and his bullets were generally fatal. The legend says that once more the biter was so badly bitten that he never recovered from his wound. In other words, Tom killed him. So that's it for this episode, another in our series on the life of Tom Quick, based on this 1851 book by James Quinlan. We are about a third of the way through this book, and some of the upcoming chapters discuss Tom's actions during the United States Revolution. Most of the stories that we read in this episode seem to have come after the French and Indian War, where there was supposed to be peace, but Tom seemed to continue his war against the Indians. In several of these stories, Tom could have been said to have been defending himself against Indians who were trying to kill him, the Indian slayer. The most notable of these stories was the one where Tom supposedly captured 6 Indians' hands in a split log, and then killed them. That story was told to the author by a man who was more than 100 years old at the time of the publication of this book. Let us know what you think of these stories and if you think they're all true in the comments below. As the authors mentioned at the beginning, these were stories that may have been embellished over time, or possibly not even true at all. And stay tuned to this channel for more history about Tom Quick and other early Americans. This channel is called Unworthy History because we cover actual history that has now been deemed unworthy to discuss on history channels on TV. Those channels have largely abandoned their mission. So here on this channel, we try to keep actual history alive by reading directly from old books. If you'd like to support our channel, then you can join our Patreon page or become a YouTube channel member. Members will have full access to all of our members-only videos, and your contribution towards keeping actual history alive will be recognized at the end of each episode. So if you want to see more episodes like this, then be sure to like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time on Unworthy History.